you very much. I'm delighted to be with you. Just a little background on what I'd like to talk about, the next America or tomorrow's America. Marjorie and I spent some time in San Francisco a short time ago with our grandchildren, Nikki and Teddy, who are 7 and 5, and with Stephanie and our son, David. And it was interesting to be there. It was interesting to think about what America's going to be like for Nikki and Teddy. But while we were there, we also spent some time with Stephanie and David talking about the work they do. They both were working with internet companies. David at that time was with Facebook. And we spent a day or so at Facebook, and I was just marveling at what the digital workplace looks like anymore. Facebook is a campus, and there are no hours for the staff there. They can work anytime they want to work, and they're evaluated on the success of their programs and their projects as opposed to the hours that they work. And while flying back, I began to reflect on what will tomorrow's America be like for Nikki and Teddy. And that's when I started doing some research on this for a course. And what came through is there's some major areas that have potential to change America tomorrow. One of them are the generational differences. There's a growing school of thought that the young people in America today are facing a hard time and will face a hard time. As a matter of fact, there are those who are saying that they may not have a standard of living equal to their parents. So young and tomorrow's America face some real challenges. Then there are demographic changes. There's a school of thought that says that the United States is in the process of becoming the most racially and ethnically diverse country in the world. And the question then becomes, what does that suggest for e pluribus unum and one nation indivisible? And then when you take a look at other changes, clearly you've seen them. We've seen major cultural changes in this country, decline of marriage, growth of children being born to unmarried mothers, and abortion, divorce. There's a growing school of thought that says that the next America or tomorrow's America will be a nation in decline, and yet there are others saying what you're beginning to see is the growth of moral freedom in tomorrow's America, people to live the life that they want to live. And finally, while doing this research, I had to take a look at what does national security portend for the next America. There are those who continue to say the United States must continue to be a major global superpower. That's the only way that you can maintain stability in the world of the 21st century. There are others who are saying, take a look at this country, the staggering national debt, the crumbling infrastructure, and what's happening to our schools and colleges, and what's happening across cultural America. And so there are conflicting points of view with regard to how do you find national security for tomorrow's America. There are those who say we must continue to have our global superpower with our military. And yet there are others who say, take a look at the America of the 21st century. National security will depend on rebuilding the America of the 21st century. Let's spend a little time on looking at each of these. And first, the generational differences. In his book called The Next America, Paul Taylor takes a look at generational differences in America. He takes a look at the 4 generations, the millennials born after 1980, the Gen Xers born from 1965 to 1980, the baby boomers, who you're all familiar with, born from 1946 to 1964, and then the silent generation from 1928 to 1943. What's so interesting when he takes a look when he takes a look at these different generations, he focuses principally upon the 76 million and 80 million strong boomers and millennials. They're the biggest of the four generations, and each significantly play a major role in tomorrow's America. In the case of the baby boomers, the population growth is the product of the spike, as you well know, after World War II. And as Americans, young people, the millennials, enter the workforce, boomers, of course, are in the process of retiring, but some boomers, because of hard times and other reasons, are continuing to stay on the job and delaying their retirement and continuing to work. And this juxtaposes a set for potential conflicts. Some of the jobs that boomers aren't leaving are the jobs millennials aren't getting. But the conflict is more pronounced than that. In Paul Taylor's book, The Next America, he refers to an article by a demographer by the name of Joel Kotkin. It's an article with a headline that says, "Millennials are the screwed generation." And the subhead of that article reads like this: "America's boomers never had it so good. As a result, today's young Americans never had it so bad." And how does he justify calling the young Americans a screwed generation? Let me read a few lines from his article. He says, "Today's youth have been screwed by their parents and their neglect of the economy and economic mismanagement. How has this generation been screwed?" He said, "The wealth gap between the young and older Americans now stands as the widest on record." He said the median net worth of households headed by someone 65 or older is $170,494. The median net worth for younger households is $3,662. And he said there are major changes as a result of that. Then he goes on to say, the screwed generation also enters adulthood with their parents and grandparents, leaving them a country with a $20 trillion national debt. These are debts that the boomers have incurred, and this debt spirals ever more out of control. And this public debt constitutes a toxic legacy handed over to offspring who will have to pay for it in at least three different ways: through higher taxes, less infrastructure, and less spending for social needs in this country. And then he takes a look at the debt of also these young Americans. And young Americans now are graduating from college with an average debt of about now $37,000. And the debt for tuition debt across the country in this century, in this year, now stands over $1 trillion as a result of loans for education. Then he goes on to take a look at a growing number of other issues. And let me take a look here at how he brings this to an end and see if you agree with it. He says, right now, politics is just another place where American millennials are getting screwed. Republicans want to deport young Latinos while cutting investments on roads and skills and education that would benefit younger voters. The Democrats, meanwhile, seem determined to mortgage the future with high spending on the elderly, on pensions for the elderly, and help for the aging boomers, causing indebtedness, and will pose real challenges for upward mobility for today's young Americans. So there you have it. Joel Kotkin says, the young Americans today are the screwed generation, and you screwed them. Do you agree with that? No.
I don't mean I'm just shaking my head at it. It's unbelievable.
Do you agree with Kafka?
Doctor, it's complicated.
Pardon me?
It's complicated. Everything is complicated.
It's complicated.
Well, if they're being screwed, they should do something about it.
Pardon me?
I said if they're being screwed by the millennia, they should do something about
Well, the
it.
millennials
They
don't
should
either.
react.
Well, somewhat it's failed leadership.
What's that?
In some sense, it's failed leadership.
It's not the failed people.
They got failed. Changing the F word around a little bit. I'm sure you understand. But the leadership failed them. Leadership did not understand what was had the foresight to see what was going to happen. Other leaders in other countries also screwed up.
In some respects, I think you're right. You have to wonder, is that the reason why so many of the millennials are jumping on the bandwagon for Bernie Sanders? You know, he's talking about the failed leadership of the establishment politics, free education for kids going to college and universities. But you know, there's another school of thought. Robert Reich was the Secretary of Labor for Bill Clinton's administration. And he says that the elderly are not the problem as far as the young people are concerned. He said what you have to take a look at is the concentration of wealth among the 1% in this country. He says over time, we need a political revolution so that we can get the nation back from the moneyed interests. He concludes by saying this extraordinary concentration of income, wealth, and power at the very top imperils all of our economy, our democracy, and the revival of the middle class. And he concludes by saying that it's time to stop arguing that the elderly are screwing the millennials. He said the big story today is how Wall Street is screwing Main Street. God, there's a lot of screwing going on. Do you agree with this?
It's obvious. Look at the growth of population.
Oh, sure, sure. I would be inclined to agree with Robert Reich on that issue. But then let's take a look at some other changes, the demographic changes that are taking place in this country. And what you're beginning to see is the changing face of America. And what you're beginning to see that there's no question that in tomorrow's America, the United States is on track to become a majority non-white nation sometime between 2040 and 2050. As some have observed, we're witnessing the browning of America in the 21st century. Immigration, as you know it, is the engine that makes and remakes America. Today, the United States is home to a record 42 million immigrants and 37 million Americans-born children of immigrants. And the immigrants today are far different from the past. The big difference is where they're coming from. Half come from Latin America and about a quarter coming from Asia at this time. And because of this shift, immigrants in the 21st century are not only replenishing the workforce, they're changing our complexion. And as you know, there's a growing concern with how we handle this issue. Some Americans, like Donald Trump, said the time has come to build walls to keep these immigrants out. But it's not just guys like Trump alone are expressing concern with immigration today. A distinguished political scientist at Harvard, the late Samuel Huntington, expressed concern with the growing number of Latinos in America. He said the flow of Hispanic immigrants threatens to diminish America into two people, two cultures, and two languages, since Latinos are not assimilating into mainstream America. Well, some are saying, take a look at what's happening today. Who have been some of the major candidates for the Republican nomination? Mark Rubio, Ted Cruz. There's no question that they have assimilated. As a matter of fact, William Fry, a demographer from the University of Michigan, says that there's nothing to be feared about immigration today. He says they're reinvigorating the America of the 21st century. And he said this diversity should be celebrated. This non-white movement is arriving just in time as the white population continues to diminish. But Robert Putnam has a book called E Pluribus Unum, Diversity and Community in the 21st Century. And he's saying it's not enough to simply celebrate diversity in the America of the 21st century. He says there's a need for everyone to construct social identities for the 21st century. He said most important, whites and non-whites have to create a more generous and what he calls expansive sense of togetherness in a truly overarching identity called America. The challenge, he says, is how do we create a more diverse and inclusive America? A more diverse and inclusive America. And you're seeing movements in that direction around the country. I think it's Michigan has recently announced that it's creating a program throughout the state that will welcome in immigrants, non-whites, to come to the state and join their diverse workforce. And what they're looking at is, what do you have to do to create a more diverse and inclusive workforce in America? Then you have churches in this country that are working to create more inclusive religious institutions. And you have some communities across the country who are working to create more inclusive recreation areas. But there is an institution that's struggling with trying to create a more inclusive culture. And the irony is that this institution is one of America's most diverse and ethnically diverse institutions in the country. It's the American University. American University is struggling to create more inclusive campuses. What you're seeing is a movement to combat what they call microaggression, combat terms and phrases that some people feel is directed at their color and their ethnicity. And there's a question is, why should the American University of the 21st century start developing speech codes for their campus? And that's what's happening. And that you have students who are concerned with this, but you also have another group of major movements. The University of Missouri recently announced that their faculty should focus not only on developing and continue to develop their expert knowledge in the fields that they're teaching, but they should be working on how do they create a more inclusive classroom? How do they create a sense that these students should feel comfortable with each other? Brown University recently announced a $100 million diversity initiative on campus that create diversified and inclusive Brown University for the 21st century. Some of the critics and the alums of Brown University are saying, $100 million, why not use that to reduce tuition? Harvard University really created controversy, you may know, last week in their ongoing effort to create a more inclusive campus. They announced a ban against single-gender campus organizations beginning in the fall semester, which means that sororities and fraternities will no longer be recognized on the Harvard campus. They're saying these fraternities and sororities are engaged in self-segregation. If you do away with the fraternities and sororities, students will feel that they belong to the university, not to these little groups across the campus. Does that make sense to you?
Yes.
Ban fraternities and sororities?
No.
No?
What about the football team?
Are they gonna have a more inclusive football team?
Do away with football teams?
But there were some backlash in Harvard against that by some women's groups. I don't know if they were actually sororities.
Yes,
And
that's
some-
right, they were
and-
demonstrating.
And some of the women said that they felt very safe in their women's groups and that they wouldn't like to see it be so inclusive. I guess it goes.
That's
both
right,
ways.
it's not only women's groups, but there are a number of groups on campus that feel that they need to find people that they can be comfortable with, as opposed to feeling comfortable with, quote, the university.
The other thing that's unfortunate about Harvard is that they also said that it's not necessarily the sororities and the fraternities, but it's also that someone who is running for student council or whatever they might call it at Harvard, they cannot run if they are a member of these groups, which seems to me to be a little heavy-handed, and I'm not sure that they can accomplish that.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, the demonstrators on campus
Interesting.
Right,
were arguing that they're doing away with our right of association.
yes.
Can't they buy a piece of property off campus? Harvard can't stop them if they buy a property off campus and they live together and have.
And
all
it's
of-
not, but it's not only the sororities and the fraternities, because even up at SU, there are physics groups that are just composed of women because of the backlash. So it's not only sororities and fraternities, it's all kinds of clubs
Or
that they're talking
organizations
about.
for
So,
bisexuals,
yes.
transgenders, or
Right.
organizations based on ethnic identity, et cetera.
right.
And the question is, in doing away with these organizations, do they really feel they're building a more inclusive university, or are they isolating people on campus across the
Are
country?
they being pressured by the federal government funding? If you don't do this, you can buy money. Is the federal government saying, if you don't have a totally inclusive
Harvard doesn't
campus population, then we're gonna cut your funding?
There have not at this stage been any threat from the federal government.
Yeah.
Because what Harvard is arguing is we're doing away with discrimination and segregation on campus, yeah. But Harvard created even more controversy at their law school just a couple of months ago, when they removed the plaque at the entrance of the Harvard Law School because it contained an image of one of their major donors, a man by the name of Reich. And he was one of the first donors to the Harvard Law School. But they removed the plaque because it had his name, and he used slaves on his sugar plantation. But it's not just there. The University of Maryland just announced a short time ago that they're removing the name of Byrd from their stadium since Senator Byrd was a segregationist. And the movement continues. Students at Yale University have called for the removal of the Calhoun name from Calhoun College because John Calhoun, a graduate of Yale, was a white supremacist. And Princeton University just announced that they would not remove the name of Woodrow Wilson from the School of Public Affairs. There was a student movement there calling for the name of Woodrow Wilson to be removed because he was a racist who supported the Ku Klux Klan. So the question, when you take a look at today's universities, are they creating a more inclusive campus by removing symbols and names associated with racism in the past? Or are they simply rewriting history? Pardon me?
Rewriting history.
Yeah. Yes.
I think the purpose of history is to try to learn from it and not obliterate it.
That's a good
Pretend
point.
that it didn't happen.
Yes.
Oxford University is fighting the elimination of Rhodes statue because.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Oxford University in England is fighting the elimination of the Rhodes statue
Oh, yeah.
for the Rhodes Scholarship because the blacks there said that he was a racist. And they say, but he did more things than being a racist. We're keeping the statue.
When Princeton announced that they would keep Wilson's name, they elaborated on why they did that, and they reinforced that you just made. They said by keeping these names on these institutions, it gives students on campus an understanding of what the university was like and what segregation, racism was like in the past, and how far we've come since then. So keeping those names and getting students understanding that is good history for campuses across the country. Then what you have is, when you take a look at tomorrow's America, is what some are calling cultural changes and cultural challenges. In Taylor's book, The Next America, he poses a question on how do we determine the future of marriage in America in the 21st century? What's happening to marriage in the 21st century? And he talks about the diminishing number of marriages now taking place. Today, he says, just 20% of adults 18 to 30 are married compared to 60% in 1960. And young Americans are clearly expressing doubt about the need to marry. So when we look at tomorrow's America, are we looking at a time when marriage will become obsolete, do you think?
I'd like to go back to the previous question about this removing the signs.
Yes.
In accounting, you're supposed to never erase. You leave a trail, and you add an asterisk explaining why what was there is wrong and why
Right.
you're changing it. On these signs, why not leave the person's name and underneath put another plaque and say, but he was a segregationist, or he supported the Ku Klux Klan, so that they have the history, but also an explanation of what the person was.
That would make sense for those kids who are not informed, but what these movements are happening on campuses is students themselves have been behind a lot of these movements to remove the names because they recognize the history of those whose names are on buildings across.
But you can't change history.
Yes, you can. if you want.
And maybe one day reminding them what it's like, yes.
I think most people agree that nobody's perfect.
Pardon me?
Nobody's perfect. I think most people agree with that, so any.
Donald Trump, is it?
In their mind, right?
He is bulletproof.
So everybody's gonna have something against them. You know, he didn't do this, or he did that, or whatever, so we'll have to have two plaques for everybody did something.
Yes.
Indeed, a lot of people have an outcry when they see ISIS destroying some historical relics, say in the Middle East, or when the Taliban destroyed relics in Afghanistan. Isn't that erasing history based on their current political beliefs? Should we support one and not the other?
That's a good question, yes.
Who are we to criticize, right?
I was just wondering, do you think that, you interact with a lot of young people on campus, do you think that they have, generally, do you think they generally have the ability to put in context the situations that these historical figures lived in at the time, and the decisions they made, the mistakes they made, for example, regarding slavery? Is there a kind of a general ignorance of history on campus? And just another quick comment. The idea that this movement about banning speakers, from commencement speakers, albeit Madeleine Albright or other important figures from speaking on campus, is a terrible, in my opinion, terrible thing. I have a distinct recollection of when I was at Dartmouth College, of going to a place called Webster Hall and watching a speech by George Wallace, who was, as you know, governor of Alabama, rampant segregationist, surrounded by Alabama state troopers, but he was invited on campus to speak as a, because there was freedom to have alternate views brought to campus. When you destroy that, you really insulate these young people from an array of opinions that they should be exposed to, I think. I don't know. But it doesn't sound like a good trend.
I think when you mentioned that students were protesting Manlius Albright's appearance on campus, tell me something about what students are like today. There's some people that they just don't want to listen to anymore. But, you know, I think where you could do that, probably, is some coursework in history, so that students can understand the history related with this, again, so they can see what the nation was like then and what it's like now.
Do they care about history?
Well, they care about history if they're putting up fights and they're demonstrating. I think the other question when it applies to education is, if there are folks that are so adamant about being strong-willed and strong-spoken, are they willing to leave a school like Harvard and give up that diploma just for the sake of owning their own opinion?
No.
They're not going to give up that diploma from Harvard, or even Syracuse, or Cornell, or Ithaca. That's what they're there for, is to get that diploma. That diploma gives them a key and a road and a path for a professional.
What you see at Harvard and other schools where you see these movements taking place is also some faculty who don't support these movements. And as a matter of fact, faculty demonstrated with students last week on the Harvard campus when they banned sororities and fraternities. So there are major divisions taking place on campuses across the country now. So the question is, are these campuses creating more inclusive kind of campus by doing away with certain organizations, or are they destroying history by doing this? Yes.
Well, I do think that we also have to think, and I know that your next part is about culture, and I do think we have to take a little bit of time to think about different cultures.
Pardon me?
We have to take some time to think about the different cultures. I happen to have taught part-time at SU, and so I do have addressed some student issues like that. What I saw on campus is not students trying to come together, but I saw a lot of division. And so it's kind of like students wanted to hang together and to try to get an open discussion in a classroom was very, very difficult because of the different cultures, because of the different worldviews, because of different socioeconomic backgrounds. All of those things really played into trying to get this more inclusive kind of community. Also, we have to think about how we are all censored by political correctness, and how do we have the language to actually talk about how to include people. And this is when I'm talking about anyone, whether it's gender or whether it's age or whether it's race. How do we get people to have that kind of language to start to talk about these things?
That's a very good question, yes. Yes.
I have two concerns. First off, I agree with you that we wouldn't be able to name anything after anybody because you'll find something in their past. The other thing, I don't like seeing a precedent of a student uprising to change a name and then we give in. It's a precedent, and with the speeches, that's almost a form of bullying. And that's a big problem on campuses. And I think that's almost like a reverse bullying, and I don't like that.
Yes.
At Ithaca College last fall.
Pardon me?
And Ithaca College last fall, they had the students, well, a group of students were quite against the president. And my granddaughter was a freshman there, and she said, they're just a group that are trying to raise, just kind of get everything going. And she
Yes,
said
I
the
saw
majority
that.
of them didn't.
And they said that he was insensitive to the fact that there were racial concerns on
Yeah, and
campus.
she said she
And he
hadn't seen
resigned.
any. He resigned as a result, but she said she hadn't seen any of that. I said, but do you see this going on? She said, it's a group of people that just want to make a statement. You know, she was kind of upset with him. And then I hated to see that he resigned.
Are these the same students that are borrowing money and then asking us to pay for their defaulted loans? Just a question there.
Well, what do you tell them? What they're saying is we're trying to create, quote, a more inclusive kind of community. And what we have to do is do away with the historic past in which we created such divisions within our society. And it's really a matter of building not necessarily an inclusive campus, but in my judgment, a politically correct campus.
But doesn't that start in the local schools where they've replaced American history with social studies? And it's all rewritten. So I mean, if you really want to make those changes, then you have to get involved locally and go to school board meetings and look at the books that are being used and say, hey, as a taxpayer, this is a rewrite of history, don't want it.
You know what it also suggests, I think, is the need to revitalize civic learning in the classroom. There was a time when citizenship and civic education was required of all students on schools across the country. That's no longer there, and I think we're suffering the consequences.
So was the English language.
Pardon me?
So was the English language.
I know. Yes.
I have to laugh. I was reading an article, all over to do about Harriet Tubman replacing Andrew Jackson.
That's right.
Well, on the bill, and this article said that Andrew Jackson never wanted to be on the bill. I thought, what is this all about?
Let's go back to tomorrow's America. Let's ask ourselves, how does education play into tomorrow's America, which is kind of addressed? And let's talk about even how the economy plays into tomorrow's America, and even prison cycles, urban growth, transportation, infrastructure, agriculture, and technology.
We
Let's
only
think
have
about
15 minutes.
Okay, we can blow up the 15 minutes in any one of those subjects, but let's not just talk about what's going on in Syracuse campuses and Harvard campuses. let's give some thought to what's gonna happen as technology translates and impacts and influences tomorrow's America. How is agriculture going to impact tomorrow's America? Give that some thought. Start a discussion about that, if you can. I would look for a start, but I would do a subject that mattered.
Do that in 15 minutes.
Yeah.
I don't wanna
No,
change the subject in case somebody has an answer for Lou's comments. But as our democracy travels down the road, I see some problems, and this is what I think part of our discussion is gonna be about here. A real disconnect, I mean, between people and what makes democracy work.
Between people.
People and what makes a democracy work. And I'd love to hear your comments about this, because there are so many people today who, whether they're millennials or whatever, they get their information in totally different ways than we do, or did, let's put it that way. And, you know, they don't connect up with what's going on politically, you know, economically, even whatever. They don't connect up with that because they're so busy doing what they're doing to be trying to be successful or whatever. I don't know. And I see some real serious problems down the road. I mean, you know, we see some of the political candidates today. I'm not saying they're all bad, but you know, there's some problems. People say, well, we have all these people. Can't we come up with some better people involved who want to be leaders in the country? You know, I mean, I think it's a serious problem for the future of this country, whether it's economically, politically, socially, whatever.
When Alexis de Tocqueville wrote his book, Democracy in America, he said, what was striking about the America that he saw was that democracy began with conversations. People frequently formed community organizations, talked to each other. And what you see now, given what you just said, is a growing number of young people especially say, why do I have to talk with anybody when I can just tweet? And I think that poses a serious question, because the question is, how often do people come and get together, get a chance to talk like what's happening here today? Doesn't happen very often. And I think that's a very serious problem that faces America right now. Yes.
Isn't that the way they talk to each other? Everything's on the internet and the social networks, and that's the way the young kids communicate.
Yeah, but also what you'll see in that kind of communication is they simply communicate with people they agree with. If they feel that they disagree with a person, forget about it. What I'd like, given the time that we have, is simply spend a few minutes on these other changes that are taking place and that will have an impact on tomorrow's America. What I refer to is a study of Paul Taylor's Next America is happening, what's happening to American culture in the 21st century. What's happening to marriage? Is marriage becoming obsolete in this country? And as I mentioned before, what he points out in his book, he said today 20% of adults 18 to 30 are married compared to 60% in 1960. And young Americans are clearly expressing doubt about the need for marriage. So the question is, what's the future of marriage? Is it becoming obsolete? And why is that the case? There's a school of thought that puts it this way. Not long ago, marriage was the only socially and morally acceptable gateway to sexual partnerships. But today, sex among unmarried adults carries little, if any, stigma. As you recall, it wasn't all that long ago that it was morally wrong to shack up in America. Remember that? But people no longer shack up in America. They cohabitate. And that's acceptable. But you know, it's not just that people are concerned with regard to cultural change in America. what you had from a study that was done last year is 40% of the children born last year were born to unwed mothers. 40% of the children born last year were born to unwed mothers. And you've noticed the stories over the past couple of days. Why are people talking about transgender rights in America? Seen the stories? Well, how do you define transgender? This is what I saw, and I think it's a good definition. It says, a transgender person is someone whose gender identity does not correspond with the gender they were identified at birth. For example, a person may be biologically male, but identify himself as a female. And as you may know from the stories that have appeared over the past couple of days, there's controversy that's coming out of North Carolina, Texas, and Arkansas. They've all passed laws that require students in schools to start using bathrooms that correspond with the gender noted on their birth certificate. And there's been a reaction to that from transgender students. And President Obama, just this past Monday, made an impassioned argument for his administration's decision last week to instruct public schools to allow transgender students to use bathrooms that match their gender identity, saying that society must protect the dignity and safety of vulnerable children. What's so interesting about the announcement by President Obama last week is he said that those schools that refuse to permit transgender students to use the bathrooms that they want to use run the risk of having money cut off from the federal funds. And what he's saying is this the beginning of start to create support and protection for the rights of transgenders in America. So who has a right? Is it the governor of North Carolina who says that pupils in public schools must use the bathrooms associated with the gender noted on their birth certificates? Or is it President Obama who says that should be free to use the bathroom that they feel they should use given how they identify themselves? You know, that leads me to a question. How is a state like North Carolina going to enforce this law that says that students must use bathrooms that are corresponding to the gender that appears on their birth certificate? Does that mean that students in North Carolina should carry their birth certificates to school every day in order to use a bathroom? No? Yes.
They would have to hire someone to sit up in front of the restaurant.
That'd be good, more jobs.
Yes.
There's a problem with that. That person that's gonna stand outside the bathroom and do the inspection, do you use a man or a woman to inspect? Somebody dressed as a woman, but is a man? You know, it really gets complicated.
But you know, when you take a
Obama
look,
would stick his nose in it anyway.
when you take a look at these cultural changes and challenges that are taking place in America, they're cutting across the board. There was a story that I saw the other day while doing some research that pointed to the number of churches that are closing in America today. Some 4,000 churches closed just last year. And some are beginning to say that when you take a look at all these cultural changes that are taking place in America, and people becoming distancing themselves from churches and religious institutions, there's a school of thought that says, are we seeing a tomorrow America in which a country is in moral decline? There's a school of thought that says it's not a moral decline. Alan Wolf, who's a member of the faculty at Boston College, recently published a book called Virtue in a World of Choice. And he says, we are simply seeing the growth of individual freedom in the 21st century. Quote, we have become a more open and democratic nation in the 21st century with the growth of moral freedom. So what is it? Are we a nation of moral decline, or are we witnessing the growth of moral freedom? Do we have any time left? Let me just, okay, quickly. The question now that I'd like to wrap this up with is, what will national security look like in tomorrow's America? You know, there's a conventional school of thought led by people like Robert Kagan, who's a national security expert, who was advisor to Mitt Romney, who is expressing concern. He says in his new book, The World America Made, he says he's making a forceful argument against those who now say that the United States should redirect its attention and resources from overseas to rebuilding an aging America. And what he says, if we start moving away from our global role that we have across the globe today, what you'll see, he says, is war after war after war. He said America's global presence maintains peace in the world today. But then you have another person like Richard Haas. And what surprised me, he's the president of the Council on Foreign Relations. And he has a new book that I would suggest you might want to take a look at that says, Foreign Policy Begins at Home. And what he says is, when you take a look at national security today, what you have to take a look at is problems like the problem with drinking water in Flint, Michigan. What you have to take a look at is a crumbling infrastructure in America today, the collapsing bridges, our staggering national debt. And he said the biggest threat to the United States comes not from abroad, but from within. And he says that in order to be secure in tomorrow's America, we have to rebuild the America of the 21st century. And yet, Robert Kagan says we have to maintain our global role, or we'll see conflict after conflict. So who has the right for the next America? Maintaining our global military presence the world over, or begin to use those resources to rebuild the America of the 21st century?
I think they're both right. I think you need a strong economy as the foundation of a strong military. But engagement can be at different levels. We don't necessarily need to be so engaged where we put 100,000 troops in a location, but we engage in dialogue and encourage good behavior throughout the world.
What are you running for office for? Yes.
You referenced de Tocqueville.
Yes.
And when de Tocqueville wrote his book regarding American democracy, the people that voted in America at that time were property holders. If you go back and check history. And the reason America is going to keep going into a major decline is because people who don't have a stake in the game get to vote. And that's what started all this community activism and things like that. You get people out there that don't have a stake in the game that keep asking for more and more and more, and you can't stop it. Britain can't stop it. It's over already. I mean, it won't matter for us. It's going to matter for our grandchildren and possibly our own children. But the train's already left the station. And as you bring in more immigrants, and we fund them, we give them food stamps and health care and apartment, and everything. And they don't have a stake in the game, and all of a sudden, they somehow or another get the ability to vote. What are they going to do? They're going to ask for free tuition. They're going to ask for more health care. They're going to ask for more welfare. They're going to ask for more food stamps. And it cannot be stopped, ladies and gentlemen. It is over.
Trump has it right, build walls and keep them.
Oh, I'm not saying anyone has it. I'm not saying anyone has it right. I think our forefounders knew.
Do you have it right?
No.
Why are
No.
you saying it then?
Well, because I think everyone should hear it.
You're just sharing your observation.
I'm sharing my opinion. This is America. It's still free, I think, until you take the money from the 1% and give it to the people that don't have it.
You're talking about socialism.
Yeah.
I think one of the other questions, when you walk away from this particular discussion, is one, I've been doing this for a number of years, and I don't remember another vibrant, interactive discussion in any of the programs that we've had. And thank you for that. Number two is, think about what would happen if America did not exist. Don't start the conversation now. But when you leave and you go home and you're sitting on a can or having, say to yourself, Nita, don't look at me that way. Think about what would this world be like without America. Okay?
And let me conclude by asking you, are you ready for tomorrow's America?